Okay, so they've given us an augmented matrix, and they want us to manipulate this matrix to make it look like reduced row echelon form, which looks like this, where we have a diagonal of ones, and then we have zeros both below and above that diagonal. So to begin this process, I need this to be 1. So what I'll do is I will take 1/2 of row 1, and I will call that the new row 1. So this says what I'm going to do, and this is the row that is going to be changed according to this. So if I do that, I get the following. So now that this is a 1, what's the next order of business? The next order of business is to turn this into a 0. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply row 1 by 3. I'm going to multiply row 1 by 3. I'm going to add that to row 2, and that'll give me the new row 2. So let's see what that does. So I hope you're using a calculator because the fractions will be many. So I have 1, 0. Up next, I need this to also be 0. So what I'll do is I'll multiply row 1 by -5. See that? I'll multiply this by -5, row 1, multiply by -5, and then add it to row 3 to get the new row 3. So that'll look like this. Let's see, so multiply by -5, it's -5, add it to this, that's 0. Multiply by -5, it's -5 over 2, plus this on a calculator would be -1/2. Multiply by -5, it's -5 over 2, add it to this. Multiply by -5, whatever that is, add it to this, and the calculator will say 1/2. So I have the 1, 0, 0. So that's good. Up next, I need this number to be 0. So what I can do, based on what I see, to turn this into a 0, what I can do is I can merely add row 2 plus row 3 to get the new row 3. Because if I add these, that's a 0. And that's what I'm currently focused on, turning this into a 0. So let's see what we get. Okay, so this is working out nicely. I have 1, 0, 0, and this is a 0. What's next? Well, I could try to turn this into a +1, or I could try to turn this into a +1. Sometimes it doesn't matter. For now, I can quickly turn this into a 1 by multiplying row 3 by a -1 to get the new row 3. In other words, switch all of these signs. Okay, so I have my 1, 0, 0, 0 here, 1 there. So the bottom row looks really good. I need a couple more things here and we're done. Up next, let's turn this into a 1. How? Well, based on what I see, I can multiply row 2 by 2 to get the new row 2. Because if I multiply this by 2, it turns it into a 1. So I multiplied all these by 2 to get the new elements of row 2. Now, what's next? We have 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1. Now, if you pause to look at what you have, what we currently have is row echelon, where you have a diagonal of 1s and you have zeros beneath it. This is Gauss elimination, but we want Gauss-Jordan because they said to give them reduced row echelon. So for reduced, I need the zeros below and the zeros above. So these have to be zeros. Does it matter which ones you make 0 first? Yes and no, not really. So based on what I see, again, these problems, you got to take them case by case. But based on what I see, I can turn this into a 0 by going this plus that. And that will not undo any of the hard work that we did in terms of making these zeros and ones. So let's go row 3 plus row 2 to get the new row 2. Okay, looks like 2 more steps and we're finished. All I need now is for both of these to become zeros. So let's see, let's make this one a 0 first. How? Well, it says 1/2. What can knock out a 1/2? A -1/2. And since this says 1, what I'll do is I'll take row 2 and I'll multiply it by -1/2, because that'll turn this into a -1/2, which I can then add to row 1 to knock this out. And that's to get the new row 1. So let's try that. So this step that we just did, that was really tricky. So let me just go through that again. So I took all of the members of row 2 and I individually multiplied them by a -1/2. And whatever that gave me, I added that to the corresponding member from row 1 to get the new member of row 1. So multiply by -1/2, 0. Plus 1 stays 1. Multiply by -1/2, it's a -1/2. Plus 1/2, 0. Multiply by -1/2, 0. 0 plus that stays that. Multiply by -1/2, that's -1. -1 plus this is that. And then row 2 and 3 stay the same. Now our last step before I let you go is to turn this into a 0. How can I turn this into a 0? It's kind of like this one, but this time it's row 3. So I'm going to take a -1/2 of row 3 and add that to row 1 to get the new row 1. So this here is the answer. All of this work is the answer because it addresses the initial goal, which was to take this augmented matrix and to perform upon it elementary row operations until that augmented matrix looked like reduced row echelon form, which this is, because you have a diagonal of 1s and everywhere below and above it are a bunch of zeros. So this is the answer, but just as a quick FYI, if this problem had had variables like x, y, and z, or a, b, and c, then these numbers would have represented the values of those variables. Like this would have said x equals 1, y equals 2, and z equals -3. So this would have been the answer given to us from reduced row echelon if the original problem had had variables. But it didn't, so it's not the answer. The answer is all of this writing up to this point here.